Tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to all of you. And for this video, we're looking at the 7th Sunday in Easter, Ascension Sunday, and we're particularly looking at the Psalm set for that day, Psalm 68. You may recall that in the previous videos, we've talked about resurrection hope for the individual, resurrection hope for the community in Psalm 66, the individual is Psalm 31, Psalm 66, the community. And here on Ascension Sunday, we have a psalm which really speaks about the resurrection hope of the cosmic restoration of God's rule. Now, this one might be a little bit more challenging for some of us. It starts off, "Rise up, O God, and scatter your enemies. Let those who hate God run for their lives. Blow them away like smoke, melt them like wax in a fire. Let the wicked perish in the presence of God." I just want to warn you against one way in which you might deal with this psalm that I don't think is a very productive one. It's become common to draw a distinction between these Old Testament passages which speak of divine violence and it's sort of a New Testament Jesus who only works in terms of peace. But I would suggest if you're thinking about that, perhaps have a read of Matthew chapter 24 and Jesus' own words when he promises that he will be the agent of divine violence at his return. Now, this is of course not the whole of the message of Jesus, but it is part of the message of Jesus. In ancient times, there was a person called Marcion who wished to draw the same distinction that we see coming in modern times too. And so first of all, he got rid of most of the Old Testament and a number of other things in Paul's letters, but he actually ended up taking his scissors to the Gospels and deleting a lot of Jesus' words. Because unfortunately, Jesus does, unfortunate in the sense that if you've gone down this track, Jesus does speak of bringing an end to evil through force. And it's expressed in the language of divine violence. You're going to have to grapple with this. The same Jesus, who is the bringer of peace, who is gentle and humble, says that he will return and bring about an end to evil forcefully at the end of time when he returns. Now, the way that I think these two things go together is that we have been offered as humanity an opportunity to embrace the peace and justice of Jesus Christ and his rule now voluntarily. And the task of the church is to share in God's mission of bringing about this rule in the world now, not through force, but through gentleness and humility. Our task is not to be the agents of God's violence, and when the church has misunderstood this, it has done some terrible things. But nevertheless, we ought to warn people that if they refuse to bring an end to their own evil, God will bring an end to them. This is actually a hopeful message because it turns out some people are very stubborn in their own commitment to evil. You think about, this is sort of the landmark one. Adolf Hitler showed, to my mind, no signs whatsoever of wanting to come under the rule of Jesus. I think it was a good thing that his oppressive empire was brought to a forceful end by nations, not by the church. And I think it's good that we can hope that all those evil oppressors who refuse to turn away from their oppression will one day be brought to an end. This is hopeful for oppressed people. It's not something which we ought to fear. In fact, you'll find that these psalms, like Psalm 68, are often popular in those places where people are deeply oppressed. And the reason is that we long for God to bring about an end to evil. Only someone who is either a psychopath themselves or had no care for other people would imagine a world in which evil was allowed to continue unchecked by God. In fact, it would cause us to have doubts about God's own character if he said, look, I'd like you to be good. I'd like you not to mistreat other people, but I won't do anything about it if you want to carry on doing it. That to me is an immoral God. And instead we see here in Psalm 68, hope for the world, that God is going to end evil by force amongst those who do not voluntarily end their own participation in oppression. So there's beautiful language in this. There's a recollection of God's saving work in the past when he freed them from oppression from the land of Egypt. And there's also a comparison with all of the other powers in the world. I wonder if you can see that there in verse 15. The mountains of Bashan are majestic, but even these other mountains look with envy on the place where God dwells in Mount Zion. God is the one who saves. Have a look at verse 20. Our God is a God who saves, but he will defeat. Have a look at verse 21. He will smash the heads of his enemies, crushing the skulls of those who love their guilty ways. This is in the context of God's people as a whole and the corruption of the world that comes through people behaving in evil ways. And therefore the psalm does end with a hope that everyone will come to God voluntarily, and that to those who don't, God will act to end evil. Have a look at verse 28. Summon your might, O God. Display your power, O God, as you have in the past. The kings of the earth are bringing tribute to your temple. And there's a comparison between those who have recognized, those nations of the world that have recognized God's rightful reign, and those which don't. The comparative, I think, here with Jesus Christ, which we want to draw people's attention to, because Jesus is God's king, the one who will visibly execute this reign of God over the whole world. We want to call people to give themselves to him as king voluntarily. We want evil oppressors to stop being oppressors and to submit to Jesus Christ. And we also want to warn them, because if you knew that somebody was facing danger, it would be cruel to leave them unwarned, to see that there was a truck coming towards them and yet not to warn them to get off the road. So when we see somebody who is an evil oppressor, we ought to persuade them to come under Jesus' rule voluntarily. And unless you're a deeply unkind person, you ought to warn them too that they will face consequences if they continue in their wicked behavior towards other people. Well, it's a challenging psalm to preach from, but I also think it's a really important one, and it does give hope that God will one day bring an end to evil when Jesus returns. And my prayer is that you will be able to speak this out persuasively and well, that you'll be able to help people to see that it is hopeful that God's going to bring an end to evil, that you'll encourage people, persuade them, offer words that help people to find their way into Jesus' rule voluntarily, and that because you are not an unkind preacher, to warn people that if they refuse, if they continue to seek to oppress others, that they will face, in the end, God's force in stopping them. You may find it helpful to turn to some of those New Testament passages in which Jesus himself expresses the same ideas. And you may find those are useful in your preaching too, just to help people to see that there is one God throughout all the scriptures, and he is consistent with them across these different settings. Well, as ever, may God bless you in your preparation, and may God bless you in your preaching for the benefit of others and for the honor of Jesus' name. Kia ora tātou.